Welcome to the RSP Cast Film and Theory. Adam Harstad, Matt Waldman joining you once again this week. We're going to talk about trading for picks in Dynasty, as well as trade deadlines in Dynasty. What's the utility of them? And then we'll touch upon Trevor Lawrence and maybe what his value looks like moving forward, and whether or not, he's a problematic player for valuation, and what that speaks to about valuation in both Dynasty and redraft when it comes to certain players of his type. So, Adam, where do you want to start? Should we start about trading picks, or should we talk first about the deadline?
Yeah, I think we could do those two in either order. I say let's do the deadline first, because if the deadline's there, the trades you should make are irrelevant anyway.
Right. So with that in mind, I mean, you wrote a great article in Dynasty and Theory about how, we need to talk about trade deadlines and whether there should be. So what's your argument about this, and where do you stand?
So I think the important thing to realize is that in Dynasty, in fantasy football, really in any competitive game, something that's played recreationally for fun, but also has a competitive aspect to it, there's really two layers at play. And the first layer is going to be the competitive layer. And the competitive layer is going to be zero sum. If I win a championship this year, that means you do not win a championship this year. If you get the number one overall pick, that means I do not get the number one overall pick. Even on a week-to-week basis, every time I win, my opponent loses. And in theory, you could make non-zero sum competitive games, and like game theorists will come up with these as toy models and things like that. But for the most part, basically any sort of competitive endeavor you engage in is going to be zero sum, and it's going to have that zero sum layer. And you can't really optimize on that zero sum layer. Like tanking is a great example. Like, tanking is bad. You can't make an argument for why tanking is bad on that zero sum layer. You say, well, if you tank, you're going to get the number one pick instead of me. Okay, but if I don't tank, you're going to get the number one pick instead of me. One of those arguments is not compelling than the other. No matter what, the number one pick is going to go to one team and not going to go to the 11 others. And on the zero sum layer, it doesn't really matter who that team is. It's going to be someone. 11 people are going to be mad, and that's just how it is. There's no way around that. And so you'll see some people try to make arguments for or against tanking on the zero sum layer, where like, well, tanking is good for my team, so therefore I should be allowed to tank. And those arguments are never compelling to me. But in addition to that zero sum layer, there's this positive sum layer kind of over top. And that's where, like, you can win and I can win in some respects. If I have fun playing you in fantasy football and you have fun playing me in fantasy football, then that's a win-win. I might win the game, I might lose the game, but we both have fun in the process. And you can make tweaks on that positive sum layer. You can make, if we do something that makes the game more fun for you and makes the game more fun for me, that's a positive sum change that makes it better for everyone involved. And so I always try to focus my rules when I'm setting up leagues. I like to focus things on the positive sum layer. I'm not concerned so much with who gets the championship, who gets the pick. I'm concerned with what structures and what systems are going to produce the most total fun for everybody involved in the league. Because you can do that. And you've played in leagues that are not fun. You've played in leagues that are lots of fun.
Yeah.
It might even be the exact same rules. It might even be the exact same participants. But, like maybe you've had a league where a trade went through and the league spent the next 3 weeks bickering about that trade. Should it have gone through? Should it have been vetoed? Should it have been like, that's a negative fun experience for everyone. So like a good league rule would be something that prevents that bickering from happening in the first place. Whether it's, some leagues might like trade vetoes. I hate trade vetoes. But maybe that's what works for you. Maybe like if it's a family league, where, you have this history with these people, and like, if stuff goes wrong, you can't just like sever ties over a fantasy football league, and you're stuck with them forever. Like, maybe it's worth it having some of these draconian rules just to keep the peace, just to prevent Thanksgiving from becoming unbearable for the next 5 years because, Grandma June traded whatever.
A kicker for
Right.
a quarterback, yeah.
DeAndre Hopkins for Keyshawn Butte in their dynasty league, which and people were questioning whether Grandma June was still mentally competent enough to be playing or whether her team needs to be put in trust. And so that can make sense. And the non-zero sum solutions are going to differ from league to league. But I think it's really good to be intentional if you're a commissioner or if you're just someone who has this vested stake and you want to make sure that the league is healthy and fun for all involved, to think about like what the goals of the league are at the non-zero sum level. And so a common goal, here are some common goals that I think everybody would generally agree with. It's generally more fun if you play in leagues where better teams win more often than worse teams. It's generally more fun, but also it's generally more fun if like there's still some uncertainty. If you have a league where the best team wins every week, that's not going to be fun to play in. Just simulate the rest of the season. What's the point? But having that any given Sunday variance, that's good, where the worst team could catch a lucky break and take down the best team and nobody ever feels safe. To me, that adds fun. So I like head-to-head scoring because it gives that variance, and it's not the most fair, but it optimizes more for the make things exciting and stressful element. But a common one is you want better teams to win more often. And in Dynasty, I think one of the most important ones is you need bad teams to have a path back to relevance. Because if you have the worst team in the league and there's just no way to get back, if Dynasty leagues awarded the number one overall pick, if that was a prize to be won, if the best team, the team that won the championship, also got the number one pick as a reward, that league would probably fold pretty quickly because it becomes this self-reinforcing advantage where the best teams keep getting better and better and better. And if you have the 11th or 12th best team, what's the motivation for you to stay in that league and try to gut it out when everything's working against you? So it's very common. I think most Dynasty leagues should have a goal where there is some sort of parity mechanism. There's headwinds against the strongest teams. There's tailwinds behind the weakest teams. The most common example of this is rookie picks being awarded worst to first. And then when you're very explicit about that like the purpose of awarding rookie picks worst to first is to create this parity mechanism, then it becomes very clear why tanking is bad, because tanking is a way to distort that and make it so some team other than the worst team winds up getting the first pick just because they were the first team to commit to the tank for the season. So tanking isn't bad because it moves the first pick from David to Sarah. Tanking is bad because it moves the first pick from the team that needs it to the team that maybe doesn't need it as much. So yeah, I like to look again at what are these important goals for the league, and then do these rules serve those goals? And trade deadlines kind of came about because fantasy football is supposed to be like a simulacrum of the NFL. It's supposed to look like the NFL, and the NFL has a trade deadline. So it makes sense that fantasy football would have a trade deadline. And in redraft leagues, especially for competitive balance reasons, you don't necessarily want a 2-10 team making a trade in week 13 with a 10-2 team. Even if there's nothing improper about it, often the appearance of impropriety is just as bad as the actual presence of impropriety. And so for the sake of avoiding those knockdown, drag out Thanksgiving arguments, it can make sense to set a deadline so that eliminated teams are no longer influencing the outcome of the season. So that teams that no longer have a stake in the outcome can no longer influence the outcome. Dynasty is a different beast because there's never a point where a team no longer has a stake in the outcome. Even if you don't have a stake in the outcome of 2023, you're still alive for 2024. No team has been eliminated for 2024 yet. And so it's important for teams to be able to make moves that they think will improve their chances over a timeline that they care about. A trade deadline is a constraint, and it's saying you cannot do what you think is the best interest in your team. And constraints can make sense. I would propose constraints on tanking. I don't think you should be able to do what's in the best interest of your team because it's not in the best interest of the league. But with trade deadlines, I don't think it has that compelling of an interest. And one of the effects of removing the trade deadline is that it allows teams to compete longer in the season. if your trade deadline is after week 10 and you're sitting right now at 4-5 after week 9, and you have Adam Thielen and Keenan Allen as your top two receivers, you can look at that team and be like, well, I think I can compete for a playoff spot. I'm one game out of the playoffs. I think if I make a push, I can make the playoffs. But if I try to make a push right now and I come up short, Keenan Allen and Adam Thielen both get a year older. My chances to trade them for fair value is gone. So maybe I'm not going to risk it. Maybe even though I'm still in the playoff hunt, maybe I'm going to trade away some of my best players right now, because the alternative is risking not getting good value for them in the future. And so you get more teams that are throwing in the towel on the season early, which is not really fun on the non-zero sum layer. It's not fun playing against a team that's basically a guaranteed win because they've traded away all their good players, or they put their players on IR, or they're cutting their older players. It's not really fair if you want to see the best teams win. If you and I are the top two teams in the league, and I face a team early in the season when he has Allen and Thielen, and you face him late in the season after he's traded them away, you're more likely to get the playoff bye than I am. You're more likely to make the playoffs in the first place than I am. So that's not really fair either. So I like to incentivize teams to compete as much as possible. I hate to punish teams for the decision to remain competitive for as long as it's viable to do so. And having the trade deadline does punish teams who decide to remain competitive. So one effect of getting rid of the trade deadline is it encourages teams to be competitive longer. It also means that bad teams can get good value for their aging players. If I'm a competing team right now, maybe I don't really want to trade for Adam Thielen in week 9 because my wide receiver rotation looks pretty strong. And anyway, who knows if Thielen's still going to be good 5 weeks from now. But if I'm heading into week 14 and I have an injury at the position and Adam Thielen is still trucking along and there's a lot more short-term clarity, all of a sudden I'm more willing to pay for that. So it lets bad teams get fair value from the good contenders, which serves as a boost to the bad teams and almost like a tax on the contenders, where now they have the opportunity to trade away future production for present production, which will, again, reduce their expected future production and kind of bring them back to the pack. So getting rid of the trade deadline serves as a really good parity mechanism. And I would argue it also rewards, if your goal is for the best teams to win the championship most often, people will argue that having the trade deadline rewards teams with depth, but it really doesn't. It rewards teams who get lucky with their depth. If I'm extremely deep at wide receiver and I suffer 3 injuries at wide receiver, I'm totally fine. I have the depth to cover it. If I suffer 3 injuries at quarterback, I'm hosed. So it's still, you're at the mercy of the injury gods. Whereas if there's no trade deadline, if I suffer 3 injuries at quarterback, I can trade one of those extra wide receivers. I can trade some of that extra depth I've acquired to get a quarterback to help me through whatever stretch I need. Having the ability to trade basically activates your depth. It's not that if you're able to trade, that like you can just acquire players at will. You have to give up something of value to get something of value. So in order to take advantage of that, you need the depth in the first place. So I think for me, when I really look at it at the positive sum layer, I think removing a trade deadline in Dynasty does more to help accomplish those universal goals. It does more to make sure that better teams win. It does more to make sure that bad teams have a path forward. It does more to make sure that the league remains competitive for as long as possible. So me personally, I think more leagues should consider getting rid of the trade deadline. Obviously, this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Every league is going to be different, but I think people never really consider it. It's just kind of an invisible part of the furniture. Like, of course, you have a trade deadline. We've always had a trade deadline. So I would encourage people to look at it more and see if maybe it makes sense for them to if not get rid of it, then at least push it back much later in the season.
Yeah, I like your sentiments with that. And one thing that I would add is that it feels like that the root cause of why we have a trade deadline and why people often want to enforce the trade deadline and believe in it and feel like that it, and give the rationales that they do. I think it's because they're draft centric and everything has always been draft centric. So it's kind of that whole, well, we've always done it this way. It's tradition. And there's never really a logical reason for it. So what ends up happening is that the people who tend to have the loudest voices in this debate often are the teams that are perennially successful, and they've done it in a certain fashion that they are used to doing. They've mastered drafting. They've mastered stocking their rosters with talents that they can to provide the depth that there is possible for them to have, that you would keep in store in case of injury during the playoffs. And so they don't want, and usually when these things come up, they're on the road to having a successful season. And when people bring up the idea that maybe we should change it, it probably threatens them to a certain level, more in ways than they want to admit, because it feels like it's threatening what they feel like they've done fairly. And why are you trying to change things to just so that it'll suit you? That's how they end up taking it. And so I think at the end of the day, we have to recognize, excuse me, with leagues, is that players have to, GMs, I think, need to be open to the idea that there are multiple types of skill sets to managing teams, and that we need to keep those avenues as viable as possible, and that, if you're going to limit trading to half the year, then, then I don't think that's really fair, because honestly, the best drafters are also usually the savviest about picking up players, not only just off waivers, but off first come, first serve. So they're drafting all year long. If you really look at it from that perspective, it's just an extension of the draft. But trading is a different animal altogether. And I would say the most conservative GMs are the ones that don't trade very often, but they're drafting all year long. So you kind of have to get it into people's heads, I think, that you've got to allow for. People are always like, well, I don't like this league because nobody trades. Well, if you give more incentive for people to trade, then that would be good. And then, when you worry about collusion or, how to manage trades, I mean, this comes down to this. To me, it's just the simple, and, obviously it's not simple in execution, but it's simple in concept, which is be mature, be an adult, and understand that there are going to be times that you're going to be dealing with people who you actually like, who may participate in some things that aren't really great, for the league. And if there's someone that you have who has a bit of a narcissistic, element to their personality, and they're trading, Zach Moss, Keishon Butte, and and Josh Wiley for, Justin Jefferson and Brock Purdy, then maybe, you guys need to step in and say, this is, and have a conversation about these things. Or if it's something that's extremely, just extremely lopsided, you probably will have to have some conversations with people and saying, look, you don't make deals that are in the best interest of this league,
Well, and that's a problem even with the trade deadline. Like, there's nothing that says that teams only make bad deals after the proposed deadline.
No.
Yeah. That's an interesting point.
It's just more heightened,
Right. Well, and I think everybody's, especially like when you're in the playoffs, I think you're more attuned to perceptions of unfairness. And that's an interesting point you make about how, like, I think a lot of the objections to the trade deadline might be zero sum too. Like, they're happening on that zero sum level, but I didn't really think about that either. But I do think that that's probably some of it. Is it's people who have a certain stylistic advantage are trying to enshrine that advantage into the rules of the league. I think a lot of the arguments against allowing trades in the playoffs or late in the season could also be repurposed and just as easily be arguments against allowing waiver claims in the playoffs or late in the season. Yeah. And yet, like, obviously you have to allow waiver claims in the playoffs. And obviously you can't allow trades in the playoffs. It's path dependency. This is how we do it because this is how we've always done it.
It's almost like we it's almost like somebody arguing that welfare is bad, but then turning right around and accepting corporate welfare. You
Right.
know, I mean, it's just that, like you said, the perception.
I would be curious. I'd have to think more on it. I mean, I don't want to be uncharitable. I'm sure there are good principled arguments for why waivers in the playoffs are good, but trades in the playoffs are not good. Um,
Because it's almost like honestly, it's almost like the only way you could say it is that it feels like that waivers in the playoffs, you're still taking an inherent risk because you're probably getting a player who is a riskier bet. Like if you're adding Aiden O'Connell in the playoffs, say the playoffs started today and Aiden O'Connell just became a starter for the Raiders, and you're like, I'm going to add him and start him, it feels fairer because
right.
he presents a
Yeah.
greater risk than if you traded for Trevor Lawrence.
As the opponent of someone who makes a waiver claim, I'm not as threatened by that waiver claim as
Yes.
than I would be. But I don't think that's a principled argument. That's not
I
difference in
don't think
kind.
so at
That's
all
difference
either.
in
Yeah.
degree either. Yeah. Uh, and then also, like, I think of Tony Gonzalez, the year he announced, like, late in the season, like, this is definitely my last year. I'm retiring after the season. Tiki Barber did it too, I think in 2005. End of the year, he said, this is my last season. After the season, I'm retiring. If you are a team that is eliminated from the playoffs and you're past the trade deadline and Tiki Barber comes out and says, I'm retiring after this season. If I'm working in the best interest of my team, what am I going to do? I'm going to cut Tiki Barber and I'm going to add somebody who can help me because Tiki Barber is literally useless to me at that point. I can't benefit from him at all. But think about it from like that, I think is much more disruptive to the league because a team who just happens to have the number one waiver priority at the time is going to get a top 5 fantasy running back for free.
And then and then it feels like that feels like cheating on a certain level, but one that we accept and get away with
Right.
in a way that we look at things. And it's funny how, like, when we look at stories, we watch movies and somebody that is a likable character in a likable situation, and they fight fire with fire by doing something that's down low and dirty, but we root for them. But if the setting were just slightly different, they would be the villain. And I think that that's a perfect example of that, because why shouldn't you be able to trade Tiki Barber and Tony Gonzalez to a team that's competing, that says, like, look, I'm a tight end short from being able to really compete with the top guy in our league, and all I need is this, and you've got him. He's no use to you anymore. I'll pay because now I'll get, this will be the win now trade that I need, and you get something back in return. I like that more, but for some reason, but it's better to.
They'd rather the bad team cut him and get nothing in return. Yeah,
yeah.
And the top teams could have traded for Barber or Gonzalez too. Yeah, I've seen some go to the extreme and say that once a team is eliminated from the playoffs, they can't make roster moves anymore, and that, I think, is the worst of all possible worlds, because now, like I said, you need to have some sort of parity mechanism where the bad teams can get better. That's definitely a good teams have the opportunity to get better and bad teams don't. That, I think, is like the worst possible solution to this dilemma where if a team has a player who's no longer valuable to them, they want to be able to replace it with something that does have value.
Yeah, I mean, what if I'm going to invoke this into play, because this is my superstitious way of saying, if you keep putting the energy out there, maybe it'll actually happen. It's from my old Cleveland Browns days of being a young fan. I still am going to do this. Is that, what happens if you're a team that doesn't really have a great quarterback, and you're looking at this and you say, the Browns really want to get rid of Deshaun Watson, and they have no chance of doing this, but Chad Kelly's sitting up there in the CFL, and they could probably pay him a modest contract, or the Vikings could pay him a modest contract. And why not take a chance and say, what, give me Chad, commissioner. I know he's not on our list right now, other than if he's in flea flicker, probably, but put him on my list and placehold him for me and add him during these weeks. And there are lots of players that I love adding during those times. If I'm out of the playoffs, shoot, I'm rearranging all sorts of things to try and get a jump on some guys that I think in year 2 might have a chance to develop, or at least give me some trade value. So I'm with you on that.
I always love at the end of the year adding recently retired players. So like Andrew Luck sits on the street all year, and then week 17 rolls around and I add Andrew Luck just in case Andrew Luck changes his mind. Probably won't happen. Happened with Rob Gronkowski. He's sitting on the street, and you get an extra 2 or 3 seasons out of a top 10 fantasy tight end because Gronk changes his mind. People change their minds sometimes. But if you're saying bad teams can't make that move, that there's this avenue to improving their teams that's only open to good teams. And yeah, it's the worst of all worlds. You have to allow transactions. And I feel, for me personally, if you're allowing transactions, you should allow transactions. I get that every league is different. And if you have a strong aesthetic objection to trades in the playoffs, that's okay. I don't want to discount aesthetic objections. It's important that you set up the league in the way that you want, and that all the participants think will be most fun. I would encourage people to think more about it, because I think a lot of times it's there by default. And if you think about it and you consider, all of the arguments, and you decide, no, I just really want a trade deadline. And that's what happened in my league. We started without one, and then a team made a trade during the playoffs and then immediately complained and said, I shouldn't have been allowed to make that trade in the playoffs. And I'm like, well, does your opponent have a problem with it? He doesn't. It was me. I was fine with it. Like, go ahead. If you want to trade for a defense, like, the odds that it even helps you are minuscule. If you want to blow out some of your future draft capital, I'm actually happy about that. But, the league decided that they had aesthetic objections to it, and so they voted to. So the irony is I have trade deadlines in all of my dynasty leagues against my objections, but I managed to argue those trade deadlines later and later and later, and now they don't kick in until the end of the regular season, which at least allows you to capture some of the benefits, and it allows teams to keep competing to the end. And so it's better than the early trade deadline. I'll still push to get rid of it entirely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that at the end of the day, if someone's making egregious trades, and it's gonna, I like to do the whole all trades are fair, and just deal with that, because sometimes even the ones that people I've seen argue in the past, that they say, oh, that was horrible, it actually ends up working out in the favor of the person who everyone thought got ripped off. And then the person that they thought was doing the ripping off ended up getting their just desserts. I mean, it doesn't always happen that way, obviously. But I look at it as that if this happens repeatedly and you're feeling like the league isn't fun anymore, and it's not just you, it's like there's 2 or 3, then maybe at that point you guys need to be able to have the side conversation with the person, and say to them, because if you do the whole voting and try and split it apart, it becomes rancorous and it's already over. But if you're like, I like to do all trades are fair, and if people are like, look, people are thinking I'm leaving this league because it's not fun, because it's one person's continually taking advantage of someone, then maybe you can get a group of people together and say, listen, you can vote to whether you're going to kick somebody out of the league or you're going to start it over. And if you have to have that conversation and that person doesn't like it and they're really taking advantage of everybody, that personality probably doesn't belong in a league. That's just the way they are. I mean, I'm just going to put it out there. I mean, I would just say people who continually know that they're flouting the rules and act like that they don't understand what people are talking about are generally assholes. And the only way you're going to deal with assholes is basically everyone's going to have to act together to say you're not allowed to do this. And if you feel like you're going to lose a friendship with an asshole, well, maybe that's a good thing, But that's my simplistic take on it. What about trading for picks? I mean, what are your thoughts with that?
I think people don't do it enough. It's hard because markets are always local. I always like to say markets are local. Everybody says, should I be trading for this player? Should I be trading for that player? And we're going to discuss later. It's very hypocritical for me to say that. We're going to discuss later. Should we be trading for this particular player at Dynasty? But the answer is always, it depends on what it costs. It depends on what you have to give up. For the longest time in my home Dynasty league, I found that future picks were just wildly undervalued. Basically, the market of people who were in on future picks was me. And so there was no bidding against them. Like, I basically could name my price. And there was, I think, a 6 or 8 year stretch where at one point or another during the season, I controlled 4 out of the 10 first round picks in every draft. Like it just got to the point where, and a lot of times I'm rolling it over. I'll trade this year's first for next year's first and second, and compounding. And I wasn't executing all those picks. I was usually trading them away. I might draft 1 or 2 players a year with those firsts. But then the league partly wised up, and it partly got to the point where 1 or 2 or 3 like really dominant teams emerged. And that kind of changes the market calculus, where you had teams that were pretty good, they're above average. And before they'd look at it and say, I'm not the best team in the league, but I'm close enough that if things break my way, I can make some noise. So I'm still going to keep focusing on older players and focusing on this season, and maybe I'll trade my picks away. Whereas when you get a couple like juggernaut teams, even the good teams are like, okay, maybe things will break my way, but I'm not gonna invest a lot more in this season because it looks like a long shot. And so you get more teams vying for first round picks. And so I don't really trade for as many future firsts as I used to, just because the prices are a lot higher and the number of teams trying to get them is more, and the number of teams willing to part with them is less. So it depends on your league. In general, though, I think that good teams are not willing enough to make trades that hurt them in the short term but help them in the long term, because we think that fantasy is a lot more predictable than it is. And we look at this and we're like, well, if I trade from this wide receiver to that wide receiver, I'm going to decrease my production by 3 points per game. First of all, you don't really know if that's going to happen. The error bars around the 2 receivers are so large that you can't say with any confidence what the impact is going to be. Second of all, even if that does happen, there's very low confidence that it will actually matter. Most fantasy football matchups are not decided by 3 points. They're decided by 33 points. And if it's like a 3-point a game difference, the odds that it flips a game that would have been a win into a loss, very, very low. Obviously, when that does happen, it's super impactful. But by and large, and occasionally too, what happens is the guy who we thought was going to be significantly worse winds up blowing up, especially over small samples. We had a team win in my home dynasty one year that was 9th out of 10 in points, and snuck into the playoffs with some like extremely favorable schedule luck. And then he had Darius Hayward-Bay and Brent Selleck just absolutely blow up. And he had the most dominant 3-week playoff run in the history of our league. He finished second, first, and first in the 3 weeks in points. And it was like Hayward-Bay, who at the time was like, at the time we entered the playoffs, was like wide receiver 60, wound up being like wide receiver 4 over the 3 playoff weeks. If he had traded away Hayward-Bay for an upgrade at receiver, ironically, he would not have won the championship. So I think good teams, they're too married to the predictability of the game, and they're too scared to say, yes, I think this trade is fair value, but I can't give up points in my lineup. I need these points in my lineup. So in general, I think good teams should be more willing to trade away productive players. And I live by this advice. When Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell were the number 1 running back and number 1 wide receiver in Dynasty, I traded them for 4 future first-round picks. And people are like, oh, I guess you're throwing in the towel on the season. I guess you're not contending. And I'm like, no, I want to win a title. I think I'm one of the best teams in the league this year. I just think the value that I'm getting back is much greater than what I'm giving up. That wound up being a very dramatic example, because that was the year Le'Veon Bell did his holdout and didn't play a single game. And it was the year before Antonio Brown did like whatever the heck happened to Antonio Brown.
Yeah.
Right. And so I got Saquon Barkley and 3 extra first-round picks out of that. And I wound up winning a title. I forget if it was that year or the next year, but like really trading away the number 1 running back and number 1 wide receiver in Dynasty made my team stronger, not in the long term, but in the short term too. So I always think my general rule is flexes for firsts. If there's a guy who I consider a flex on my roster, whether because he's older or because he's not, I'm basically willing to trade any of those guys for any future first at any time, even if it leaves me kind of with a hole in my lineup, because it's unlikely to cost me. And if it does cost me, it's unlikely to cost me as much as as I think it will. The fear there is much greater than the reality. And then I would also argue not only should people be more willing to trade productive players for future picks, I think that they should expand how far in the future they're willing to go with the picks. Everybody's always focusing on next year's first round picks. I find that the market, I was looking recently at completed trades from Fantasy Calc, and excluding trades where somebody traded both their 2024 and their 2025 first round pick, typically the number of trades including 2024 picks is about 4 times higher than the volume of trades including 2025 picks. The problem with trading 2024 picks is that pick values are very, very, they spike very high at the top. Like the difference between the number 1 and the number 3 pick is not the same size as the difference between the number 10 and the number 12 pick. It's 8 to 10 times higher. So when you're trading for future picks, you're really buying lottery tickets, hoping that these picks spike pretty high up the distribution. The problem when you're trading for 2024 picks is that teams largely have a pretty good idea of how good their team is at this point. And so the guys whose team has a credible chance of spiking way up in the distribution and getting the number 1 overall pick, they're not going to trade you their pick unless you're like willing to pay just a huge king's ransom. So your dreams of buying a first round pick on the cheap and having it turn into Marvin Harrison Jr., those are not realistic. But teams dramatically overrate how stable year-to-year performance is. And so the teams that are very good today, they assume they're going to be very good next year. And the correlation there is just super low. And so if you trade for 2025 picks from good teams, there is a really good chance that I don't know who's going to be like the consensus hot commodity in 2025, but there will be one. There always is one. And your chances of landing that guy with like an Aaron Jones are much higher if you're willing to go an extra year out in the future. Does that mean you should also be looking at 2026 picks? There, I think the advantage is much less because the correlation between production this year and production in 2025 is not really any stronger than the correlation between production this year and production in 2026.
Let me just ask this. Are you saying possibly that one strategy to take is if you're rebuilding and you're trying to like stock up on draft picks is to try and look at all the good teams in the top third of your league in 2024 or 2023 and say, yeah, give me 2025 picks, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're more willing to part with them, partly because
they're winning now. Yeah.
Right. And because people time discount, rationally so. I would not trade my 2023 pick for a 2085 pick. I'm probably not going to be alive in 2085. That's like obviously rational. You can follow that to its logical conclusion. And yes, picks this year are more valuable than picks next year. But teams will value their pick based on how good they think their team is. Bad teams will value their pick as a high pick. Good teams will value their pick as a low pick. And in terms of 2024, teams will largely be right. And in terms of 2025, teams will largely be wrong. So if you're trying to get good picks at bad pick prices, that's the play, is you target teams that are good right now. And especially even like counterintuitively, teams that are like young and good. Like if there's a team that has Jamar Chase and
Puka Nacua.
Right, and Bijan Robinson, and they're like, well, I'm young. There's no way I miss the playoffs. Like, absolutely. Like, they absolutely believe that. And the correlation is low enough that you can get that pick at a substantial discount relative to, like, if you go up to a bad team, the bad team's going to be like, well, I'm bad now. I'll probably be bad next year. Yeah. And so they're going to charge you good pick prices for their pick because they're assuming it's a good pick. I don't think trading for 2026 picks is as profitable just because the correlation isn't really any weaker. You're not more likely to get good picks at bad pick prices in 2026 than you are in 2025. And also because people hear 2025 pick and they think that this is an asset that is useful 2 years, that's like 2 years away from maturity. Yeah. But the reality is 2024 picks can net you good players today. Yeah. 2025 picks can net you good players a year from now. So it's a pick that sounds like it's 2 years from being valuable to your team, but it's really only 1 year away from maturity. Yeah. So for a lot of reasons, I think that 2025 tends to be the sweet spot.
Would you
In
add
general,
would you add 2026 picks as like a throw in, like if you're gonna get a first round, if you want to, I mean, is there a case where you would say add in a 2026 and you feel okay with that if you were
yeah,
trading for
absolutely,
them?
absolutely. I'll do anything to get the values to match, and I'm always happy to take on picks because picks are very safe stores of value. A pick is never going to go to zero. A player can, like Kirk Cousins, cruising along, tears his Achilles, value drops substantially. 2026 picks don't tear their Achilles. They don't get busted for speeding and get drug tested, and it turns out they were smoking pot, and now they have a 6-game suspension.
Right.
Doesn't happen to 2026 picks. 2026 picks don't lose camp battles.
Yeah.
There's no real downside risk. That pick's value is going to, at worst, stay where it is, at best, improve. So especially if if you have like a lot of extra value on your bench, future picks are a great place to park it. I just don't really think that there are instances where I would prefer 2025 picks to 2024 picks, especially for like really good teams. I would rather have your 2025 first than your 2024 first. I don't think there's any instance, even with really good teams, that I'd prefer the 2026 to the 2024, but I'd prefer their 2026 first to their 2024 second. Or I'd even prefer like a really good team's 2026 first to a really bad team's 2024 second, just because it has that potential to spike super high. And it's like a lottery ticket. If you land in the top three, the value gains are just so disproportionate to the cost of acquisition.
Cool. Very cool. No, I mean, I think it's very practical advice and very helpful for teams, especially right now. If you're listening to this show and you're obviously a dynasty player and you're struggling right now, then this is right up your alley, because obviously you haven't quit. Because if you quit, you probably not even listen to any fantasy podcasts right now. But I think that if you enjoy competing and trying to figure out every angle and stone to turn over to figure out how to get better, this is very practical advice with that. And I think the next topic that we're going to go to should be kind of interesting as maybe a current illustration of a player that people are trying to value in the market, and that's Trevor Lawrence. And I happen to see that you were like, yeah, I'm going to pester Matt to give his take on Trevor Lawrence on Twitter after seeing a little bit of the thread. But if you will posit what really the circumstance is for us to have this discussion.
Trevor Lawrence is a pretty interesting and polarizing player. Sometimes you will see cleavages in valuations on players between like the stat guys and the film guys, like Brock Purdy. And he's not really a good example because everybody agrees that his numbers are not necessarily wholly representative of his play as a player to date. But like Brock Purdy, if you look at the analytics, his EPA per play, his whatever, off the charts. If you look at the film, it's good. I mean, it's positive. I'm not saying he's played poorly, but it's nowhere commensurate to that level of performance, just because that level of performance is such an outlier. No level of play could be really commensurate to that.
Sure.
Tua Tagovailoa is the same thing. Like his production is just like outside the bounds of reality almost. And so sometimes you'll get like people who are coming more from a production-based standpoint or a process-based standpoint who will say like, you should be acquiring Brock Purdy, you should be acquiring Tua Tagovailoa. And sometimes you get people who are coming more from a process-based standpoint or a film-based standpoint, and they're saying, you should probably be selling Brock Purdy or you should be selling Tua Tagovailoa. Trevor Lawrence is really interesting because you have some process/film-based metrics that are really quite high on him. I think PFF has him graded, Pro Football Focus has him graded as their number 5 passer to this point. Stephen Ruiz does weekly quarterback rankings they're meant as like a snapshot in time, like who's going to give me the best chance of winning today. And he also has Tagovailoa 5th. On the other hand, Tagovailoa has never produced anywhere near that level in terms of EPA per play, completion percentage over expectation, in terms of just like raw passing stats, fantasy points. And then you also get some film guys who Scott Barrett of Fantasy Points. They have kind of a data charting operation very similar to Pro Football Focus. And he said that their data charting operation says that Lawrence is rushing through his progressions and the footwork is sloppy. Greg Cassell kind of agrees with that assessment. So there's some film guys who really love Lawrence, and there's some film guys who are not really seeing Lawrence, who say, like, no, he's actually not playing better than his production. And you get some analytics guys who like Lawrence, and you get some analytics guys who don't like Lawrence. And so it's an interesting test case where the perception around Lawrence is very similar to Andrew Luck. Like, this is a guy who is like clearly a franchise quarterback. He's going to be a long-term, high-end starter for years to come. And the performance is not there. And so the discourse today is like, is Trevor Lawrence a buy? Should you buy him now before the performance catches up? Or is he a sell? Should you sell him now before the perception catches up to the reality that's being shown by his performance? And so I have some thoughts from a data perspective. I was curious first if you had any thoughts from a film perspective on what you're saying.
Sure. And let me start with Tagovailoa and Purdy, because I thought that was fascinating to talk about how the data is off the charts, but maybe there's no way what they do film-wise can match that. And I think that that's probably true. But as someone who just watched Brock Purdy in a game that everyone's up in arms about because it's culminated a 3-week period where he's thrown 3 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, I came away unbelievably impressed with Brock Purdy on Sunday. Now, I look at things a little differently on film than some guys, and part of that is that there's 2 things I really value from quarterback play, and that's the ability to win from the pocket and the ability to really anticipate and show fast processor and pinpoint placement in tight windows. And when then if you combine all the things I just mentioned together and make plays doing that, you're in a very high tier of player. And so when I look at Brock Purdy and I see, he threw an interception to Jermaine Pratt on a busted play where George Kittle fell down on a shovel pass, and that was the only viable receiver for that play, and he had to make something up, and he threw an interception because Pratt came from the backside and made a one-handed tip to himself. And should he have thrown it? No. Was it a play that people would go, his poise isn't there? Sure. But I've seen Matthew Stafford do this. I've seen Patrick Mahomes do it. I've seen lots of great quarterbacks make this kind of mistake on a busted play, and he's in game 14 to 17, if you want to count the playoffs, in his starts in the NFL. So then he follows up with a second interception in that game. Again, Logan Wilson, context, okay? Logan Wilson baits him, and he thought he moved Wilson. Wilson cuts it off, makes a play. Logan Wilson has 10 interceptions in 3 seasons. He's a linebacker. I looked up active interception leaders on Monday just to see who they were. And, Pro Football Reference gives a nice long list. And towards the bottom of the list are guys like our linebackers. Most of them are defensive backs. But the linebackers are like C.J. Mosley and Bobby Wagner and Levante David and Deion Jones. And they all have 13 or 14 interceptions. Only 3 or 4 more. And they've played 2 to 3 times as long in the NFL with these active numbers than Logan Wilson. Logan Wilson is a fantastic coverage linebacker in terms of being able to, from the avenue of being able to bait quarterbacks into getting, cutting off passing lanes. So I look at that and I'm thinking, okay, he's thrown 2 interceptions and 2 passes. It's obviously cost them the game at that point. He was the big reason they lost that game. Did he fall apart after that? Was he Jimmy Garoppolo, where it was like completely Garoppolo'd in the way that Jimmy has always known to do? No, he leads them on a 75-yard play drive and demonstrates some really difficult throws. He has an easy throw to George Kittle, who drops the ball in the end zone, and then the next play, or in the red zone, and the next play, Purdy now has to make one of these plays that nobody likes to see, throwing it across his body, across the field, to the opposite side, on the move to his right, throwing back to his left, and completes it. And these are the types of plays I remember seeing him make at Iowa State, and I go, I don't know if he's going to be able to do it, but he's so close, and you can see how he reads it, the timing in which he reads it, and identifies it and gets it out, that I think he might be able to get away with some of these on occasion, as long as he's not reckless about it. And I've seen enough plays from Brock Purdy before all of that sequence that I'm showing you, where he's throwing it into windows of 3 defenders off of drops that are in tight pockets, and he's had to climb. Most quarterbacks don't climb pockets well. Most quarterbacks don't do what he did on the 75-yard drive, where he literally has to slide inside and climb in a compound movement, keep his feet under him, and deliver an accurate ball in a tight window. He did that. That was one of the most impressive quarterbacking plays I've seen from a technique standpoint. And he was repeatedly making these plays. And I look at that, and I look at the rest of his game, and the issues that he's having are more indicative of kind of my theory, and derived kind of from talking with scouts about how you evaluate quarterbacks over their first probably 30 starts. And that's that whole idea of first 4 to 6 games, do they look like their scouting report from college, just in a faster game with more athletes who are playing either basic defenses, their basic scheme without much tweaks, or a super aggressive scheme like what the Falcons did against Will Levis, thinking we can rattle this guy and expose him, and he's not going to get aggressive and find the open man deep, which failed dramatically on Sunday. And then after that, games 6 to 14, that's when teams start accumulating the scouting reports. They start to implement things gradually and start to look at each other's work and build a book on the guy. And so around weeks 14 to 17, 14 to 18, that to me is like the bottom for the quarterback in terms of like that phase of I'm doing what I did in college and I'm doing it well and I've got surrounding talent and I've been able to accumulate the basic knowledge of what's expected of me with the scheme and use my current abilities with some refinements to get there. And then after weeks 14 to 17 to games 30, that's when you're seeing whether this quarterback has improved beyond his scouting report. So to me, that 14 to 17 range is really the trough. It's like this is as bad as it's gonna get. Like that's kind of how I see it in theory. It doesn't always work out in that week's span. It can be a little earlier, it can be a little later, but that's usually the trough. And so when I look at Purdy in that trough, and I'm going, he's still making decisions and throws that only 8 to 10 quarterbacks make, and I wouldn't even say that many. I would say more like 6 to 8 quarterbacks actually make, because a lot of them, like Jalen Hurts and Dak Prescott, don't make those types of throws. And Prescott may not be in that conversation anymore. But there are guys that don't make those types of decisions or move this well in the pocket. So the arm strength isn't there. But yeah, I look at Purdy, and I wanted to give that in context, because then when we start to look at Trevor Lawrence and watch his film, or to put a fine point on Purdy and Tagovailoa is that both those guys are playing with all-world receiving talent. George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk is becoming an elite route runner. Deebo Samuel is an elite after-the-catch player. Christian McCaffrey is the best all-around back in football, if you're going to count receiving skills to the level that they are. So you add that to it, plus the scheme that's been pretty on the forefront for defenses to defend. And I would say, yeah, the film performance isn't going to match that, but it seems to me that those guys are a multiplier, so that when you do make a successful play, the multiplier is much higher compared to if, say, Deshaun Watson were playing lights out, but he had Elijah Moore, David Bell, and say David Njoku, okay, and say Cooper wasn't in the lineup. There's a difference. In the same way that when Tagovailoa was doing this, I mean, Jalen Waddle, if there was no Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle might be the most exciting wide receiver in football in terms of how he would probably be used with that speed element that he has. But he's just a number 2 receiver and an unbelievable high octane offense with like 4 world-class speedsters, and a couple of other pretty good runners on top of that, and a scheme that is like completely turning things on its ear. So when he produces well, yes, there's another multiplier, because you have to have a multiplier effect when someone says on film, like Jay Moyer says, Devin A. Chain's running through, 4-lane highway at 2 a.m., against the Denver Broncos, or name another team. That's that multiplier effect, because the scheme did that. How do you quantify that? That's the difficult part for folks who are trying to quantify it. But from a contextual standpoint, to maybe just simply say, hey, that's part of the numbers there, but it shouldn't take so much away from the fact that Tagovailoa is executing well, that Purdy is executing well. Now the question is, do you buy those guys knowing that surrounding talent may not last? And you could probably bet against it, and you're going to profit more if you're playing the profit game. Now, but if you're saying to yourself, I want a starting quarterback, a guy who's probably going to give me starter level numbers for the next 8 to 10 years. And yeah, they may have a couple years interspersed here where the numbers are better than the others, and where they fall out 1 year or for 2 years and then come back. I would bet on those guys based on what they do well. So then when you take Lawrence to this, I looked at the Scott Barrett's chart with adjusted net yards per pass attempt, and we got to remember, this is where context doesn't always fall into place with the number, because the number was 5.7, which is like near rock bottom out of like 40 or 50 quarterbacks, maybe more than that, on his list, because he's showing a list of, let me look at it real quick right here. He starts the conversation with quarterback efficiency, and then has a chart accompanying with it that shows quarterback leaders by adjusted net yards per attempt, first 42 games all time, has 65 players on it, and Trevor Lawrence is 63rd on that with a 5.7 adjusted net yards per attempt. So when you look at that, you're like, oh my God, no wonder we need to have a conversation about this, because people are talking about him as he's borderline elite or close to or already there, and you're talking about a guy who's in there with Trent Green and Eric Kramer, and Robert Griffin III, in terms of this low, whereas, the people at the top are Mahomes, Warner, Marino, Lamar, Jimmy Garoppolo is a bit of an outlier, Mark Ribbon, Tony Romo, Aaron Rodgers, some pretty good quarterbacks listed in there. But then when you look at the context of this, I would say, in 22 and 2023, his adjusted net yards per attempt was 6.66 and 6.24 during this past 25 game span. And in that 25 game span, I understand that you've got to look at a certain sample, and 42 has been determined in terms of, the number of seasons. But when you look at those numbers, that would put Trevor Lawrence in the top half of this chart. And then I would think the conversation isn't as dramatic of one if you're going to say that somewhere between 6.4, 6.6 is really his truer number. And so why would you justify that he does have a truer number there? And I would say my argument for it, whether it's right or wrong, is that in 2021 he played with Urban Meyer, arguably the worst NFL coach in history, who literally drafted players he was looking at Tom Luginbill's high school recruiting lists, basically, and not what they've done since they entered as their freshman year. And he had a 4.54 number. I mean, that should scream to you, this season was so fucked up, let's just give it a mulligan, because this wasn't Trevor Lawrence. This was the scheme. This was the whole coaching. This was a disaster. We need to start from scratch. So if I were going to make an argument, I would say, and especially because he had to learn a whole new scheme in 2022, and have a whole new setup. So I look at this, and that from that number, I would feel a little bit differently. And then when I look at the tape, yeah, maybe he's rushing through some progressions. I can see that on some plays, but I also see, that there's some things that are worth noting. One is that the Jacksonville Jaguars are middle of the road towards like more above average in terms of sacks taken this year. So is that because the offensive line is good, or is it because Trevor Lawrence is mobile and can create and has a strong arm? I would argue that it's more the latter than it is the former, because when they're facing teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are able to get through and pressure him consistently, and he's making throws that I look at that are high level targets, or targets that get dropped, that are right on the hands of a guy like Calvin Ridley, who I would argue, while he doesn't have a drop rate that's higher than anybody, who he doesn't have a high drop rate, the drops he has, I've seen, have been somewhat impactful. They tend to be in more impactful situations, or on plays that are harder passes that you would expect a top guy to catch. And that's just from watching him a lot in Atlanta and watching him here. I've seen some of that. He's a fantastic player, but he's not an elite player. And I think that people are expecting that to happen. So you look at some of the throws that Lawrence makes. I've seen him do a great job of reading coverage early and spotting holes and hitting, in the Pittsburgh game and in the Buffalo game, being able to make impactful plays like, find touchdowns on plays where he anticipated the openings there, or the coverage bust early enough to get the ball out. I've seen him have to make very difficult plays and avoid pressure. I'm a Lawrence fan as well, and I would be more inclined that his numbers are going to more bear out towards what Steven Ruiz is saying, what what PFF has for him at this point. And let's also understand that there's a big mystery, and I don't mean to criticize like PFF or fantasy points, because I what I really want to point out is just more from I'm being critical, but more from the standpoint of their charting is a bit of a black box. It's, you're not sitting down with these employees and what they're charting. And I can tell you, as someone who charts quarterbacks a lot, there's a lot of give and take about what an accurate pass is, about what's pinpoint versus what's not pinpoint, about what was good placement, and whether this was against a certain coverage or not. Was that really that coverage? Would you really technically call it that? There are some things that are problematic in terms and how you have to define it. And that's always been my specialty before I got to football, was when you're evaluating this type of performance, how do you cut down on the variation? How do you define the criteria? How often do you calibrate with your staff? How do you score things? What's your scoring methodology? Because that breeds more variation. So a lot of what they're doing, I don't know specifically what it is, but I can tell you that if they're probably paying people to chart, not as much as who they're paying to write. And if they're doing, and their emphasis is on getting, clicks and on getting revenue for ads and on those types of things, their business model is probably as such that the people who are doing the charting are not getting the level of training and continuous training that you would say is optimal on that end. Now, is this helpful information? I think it probably is, and they're still probably doing a good enough job for you to have good information on certain levels. But when you have issues like Trevor Lawrence, this is where the black box of what's going on in there may really be involved. And it's understandable for their business models to do what they're doing. And if they're hearing me talk about this, I'm sure they're going to get bowed up and feel defensive and feel like, well, we pay our employees are well trained and we know what we're doing. And I would say that's going to be a nice standard answer. And someone would say, who am I to say that? And I would say someone who's had 15 years of quality director training, who had to pay several $1,000s to get certified in how it is to control variation in evaluation processes that are used in Fortune 500 companies. That's what I would say. But I know most people in football writing probably don't have that experience. So I don't want to be too hard on them. But at the same time, I think that that's where the problematic of charting is. Like, it's a good idea, but they're just getting started. And if PFF has a very different number than fantasy points, or a different enough to spark this kind of conversation, that would tell me that there's a good bit of variation in how they view their charting of quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think that's all great. On Purdy, I do want to say, like, we just had this conversation just last week about how interceptions are the least reflective of the underlying level of play, and that, like, Purdy had been throwing fewer interceptions than he should have been based on his level and style of play.
Yeah.
But he just as easily can throw more. It's funny how, I love interceptions because they serve as such a referendum on a player, because they're so impactful on the outcome of the game, but they mean so little to, like, the player itself and himself and what he's actually doing. And so I think that discourse is so funny, the whole Brock Purdy thing, that when he's throwing no interceptions, everybody's like, oh, he's the greatest, and then he throws a few, and oh, he's a bum, and he's the same guy. The same guy.
And the windows are getting tighter, because teams understand what Mike Shanahan wants to do, which is throw in the middle of the field, and they're going to be tougher windows for guys that he needs to target, because Deebo Samuel's not. And when they say, oh, Deebo Samuel's not in the game. Well, of course he's not going to be as good, especially if the numbers are off the charts right now with Deebo Samuel mostly in the lineup. When you take him out, or you take Tyreek Hill out, suddenly things are going to go down if there are people who bust the curve, or who are, like, so high end in terms of what's that multiplier effect. You take Randy Moss out of Dante Culpepper's world, and guess what happens? It's the same. Dante Culpepper was not a great quarterback, but at the same time, those first initial years with Chris Carter and Randy Moss, you have two of the best receivers in the game at that time. That's gonna change things. When you hit a good play, it's going to be a great play. In the same way that if you give Bo Jackson a big hole, it's going to be different than if you give Jordan Howard a big hole. And sometimes I think we forget about that.
Yeah, for sure. I say all the time, football is not a low entanglement sport. Football is a high entanglement sport. And if you can't accept that, go to baseball.
Yeah, that's exactly, for sure. So
when I see a list like it, when I see a list like the one Scott Von Lawrence, my first thought is always, like, let's look at the top of the list, let's look at the bottom of the list. And yes, obviously I expect the top of the list to look better than the bottom of the list, because this might come shocking to a lot of your listeners, but good players tend to play better than bad players, by and large. So yes, tops of lists do look better than bottoms of lists. But let's give a moment for everybody to process that.
Yeah, you can take a couple of deep breaths. I know that you may need to see your favorite counselor after that, but okay, go ahead.
But you look at the bottom of the list of guys in adjusted net yards per attempt through 42 career starts. Lawrence, third from the bottom. That's bad. Culpepper, bottom 5. Andy Dalton, Daryl LaMonica, Steve Young, Matt Hasselbeck, Matthew Stafford. These guys are all like bottom 10, bottom 12. Hall of Famer Sonny Jurgensen, bottom 20. There's a lot of really good players at the bottom of the list. It's not, and usually the reason they're at the bottom of the list is explained by context. Either they played in a different era, or they played on bad teams to start their career. They had a lot of injuries, like Robert Griffin III. And so I ask, is there context for why Trevor Lawrence might rank it at the bottom of such a list? Well, yes. And that was Urban Meyer. And that was, we don't have time to get into everything that Urban Meyer did on the Jaguars, but it was really catastrophic in a way that is not like garden variety catastrophic. That was not just like a garden variety bad coaching tenure.
This was crimes against football. Like, if there was crimes against humanity and crimes against football, he would be charged for crimes against football in the football UN.
Yeah. And I love, like, having hypotheses like this, because ultimately they're testable. And so our hypothesis is that Trevor Lawrence's first year is unusually impactful on his placement on that. So I went to Pro Football Reference. I went to their StatHead data query tool. And I said, all right, let's look at all quarterbacks in their 18th through 42nd start, which is all of Trevor Lawrence's career minus Urban Meyer. And then let's put a threshold that gives us a similar size list. I find if you do 800 pass attempts, that gets us 70 players. So it's about the same size list. The other list was 65 players. Let's see how all quarterbacks with at least 800 pass attempts rank in adjusted net yards per attempt from games 18 through 42. And surprise, surprise, Trevor Lawrence is 19th out of 80. So out of 70. So he's in like the top quarter of the data now. You remove that one catastrophic year and he rises dramatically. You have Deshaun Watson at 15, Andrew Luck at 16, Justin Herbert at 17, Jeff Garcia at 18, Trevor Lawrence at 19, and then Bernie Kosar, Jim Everett, Joe Montana, Matt Hasselbeck, Matthew Stafford. And then these are all across the board good quarterbacks, which is the other thing that like when you use a volume filter, like 800 pass attempts, like you have to be a pretty good quarterback to get that volume filter. So that's doing a lot of the lifting. There's not going to be many bad quarterbacks on this list, but Lawrence ranks relatively high. It's not exceptionally high. He's like a yard per attempt behind the leaders. It's not a perfect list. Like Matt Schaub ranks fourth, Kirk Cousin ranks second. Those were good quarterbacks, but nobody would argue that they were top 5 quarterbacks of the last 60 years.
Yeah.
But yeah, you have this hypothesis that Urban Meyer is pulling Lawrence back. You test it and you see, yes, that's absolutely the case. Since Urban Meyer left, maybe he hasn't been a world beater, but he's been pretty solid given the context of like his age and everything. So yeah, I look at Lawrence.
Go ahead. Let's just add one thing to that. And let's just say one of the biggest problems is that we're weighing him in the context of he's the top quarterback of the past X number of years. And honestly, like, just as a draft guy, whenever I hear that, just shut that down. Like, we don't know. Just, I mean, I'm going to make my bets just like anybody else. But when you hear that kind of thing, generally take away the hyperbole. It's generally hyperbole and just say he's a good franchise quarterback prospect and leave it at that.
Yeah. And especially too, 3 years in, that's out the window, right? By 3 years, you typically have a better idea. Either he has performed as one of the best young quarterbacks of all time, and you can continue saying that, or he hasn't. And like at this point, that carries much less weight. The fact that he had such a high evaluation coming into the league, well, we've kind of seen 42 games of him play. We shouldn't be viewing him the same today as we did coming out of Clemson, because we have new information and we need to incorporate that new information. In terms of the larger discourse, like everybody always wants recommendation. Is Trevor Lawrence to buy? Is Trevor Lawrence to sell? I would say the most likely outcome for him at this point, based on what I'm seeing of the numbers and the comparables, is probably something more like Eli Manning, where he has a long, stable career of like not really top 5, not really top 10 numbers. Like he's a good long-term starter. That might be like the most, like the mode outcome. If we simulate his career 10,000 times, that might be the most common. I'm not saying it's more than 50-50 that that's how it shakes out, but like that's probably the trajectory he most looks on. The safest one,
yeah.
Right. But there's a lot of comparable players in his orbit right now who went on to have very, very high upside from there. So I'm not ruling out that like maybe Trevor Lawrence is this guy that we all thought he's going to be. Maybe he's going to be the next, like Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, like perennial top 5 kind of guy. And also there's some bad quarterbacks too. Like maybe Trevor Lawrence never really improves his efficiency from here and he becomes the next Andy Dalton. That's also in the range of outcomes. Is he a buy? Is he sell? I don't know. It kind of depends on the price that you're getting for him. I haven't sat down and ranked quarterbacks in a while in Dynasty. I have a feeling if I did, he'd probably be in the 8 to 10 range. So kind of judge based on that. I feel like a lot of the discourse is just the need to have a discussion, because I feel like the people who are quote unquote high on Lawrence and the people who are quote unquote low on Lawrence probably don't disagree very meaningfully
No.
from that ranking. I would imagine most of them have him 8 to 10 plus or minus, I don't know, maybe 3 slots.
That's exactly where I would put him, is somewhere really probably more in that 6 to 10 range. That's where I would say his likely outcome is going to be, where he has some years that with everything goes right, he's top 5 maybe 2 or 3 times over a 15-year career. And then everything else is probably more in the 8 to 10 with a couple of years outside of that as well, maybe 3 or 4 years outside of it, 3 to 4 years inside of it, and then the rest of it in that range. And I think that part of it that we have to understand is that when you look at Trevor Lawrence's game, I mean, he was closer to a Matthew Stafford type of player. The difference being that Stafford actually played in a pro style set and had a lot more pro style concepts in his game, whereas Lawrence was playing much more in a spread offense with a lot of RPOs and a lot of easy throws and a lot of misdirection stuff, but you would see flashes of the high-end physical talent. The film guys loved his high-end physical talent and saw how that could translate to a pro game, where he'd make those special throws that could kind of paint his way out of corners. That defenses would have forced him to do. He could break the scheme in essence, and he does that. He's doing that all year this year. I've seen lots of plays where he's done well with that, and whether they've been completed or not, he's put them in position to make positive plays. But at the same time, he's not quite. I don't think he's ever going to be at a Mahomes level, or at or he doesn't have Lamar Jackson's physical skills, and he doesn't have Mahomes' conceptual skills. So I think he's always going to be just outside that tier, unless his offensive line is fantastic, and they get another player who's when people look at Calvin Ridley and they see Antonio Brown, they actually get a guy who is Antonio Brown like. Then I think they'll be in better shape. Ridley's good, he's just not great, and I think that he has 2 really good receivers right now and a nice tight end. He needs if he got a Justin Jefferson, and a guy, someone like that who could improvise with him and also be special, or a Devontae Adams for a year or two, that would be maybe a game changer for him statistically. But he's not inherently that guy who, with or without, he's going to be top 5.
If I were to lay out like an Overton window, I'll throw some names out.
Sure.
I tend to think that, like, obviously people are going to disagree on stuff. I don't think there's a very reasonable case for Lawrence ahead of any of these names. I think I would expect some people would have him ahead of some of them, but I tend to think that's more of a fringe position, and rightly so. It might be right, but so the Overton window for me is, I don't think there's really a realistic way to put Lawrence ahead of Patrick Mahomes in Dynasty.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a way to put him ahead of Josh Allen. I would say no to Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert, although I think some people might argue Herbert. To me, I think Herbert has shown more, and they're both young, and so I couldn't really put him above them. I couldn't put him above Lamar Jackson. I know a lot of people are worried about the play style and how it's going to age, but we've really seen no signs, nothing to this point that would cause us concern, I don't think. And then I would not put him ahead of Jalen Hurts just because of the rushing value. But I think I could see somebody saying, like, I'm more confident that Trevor Lawrence will be an 8-year starter for me than I am that Jalen Hurts will be an 8-year starter for me. So for me, that's the Overton window. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys that I just think I can't really see any real argument for Lawrence over. And then one guy where I would not personally have him over. I would imagine most people wouldn't have him over, but I would at least entertain an argument in favor of Lawrence. So that was, what did I say, 6? So I could see him as high as quarterback 7. I think it's a lot more interesting when you get into Lawrence versus Tua, Lawrence versus Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud, Lawrence versus maybe Purdy.
Yeah.
And then I think after those guys, So how many people is that? That was 1, 2, 3, 4 guys. So I could see Lawrence as high as 7, and I could see him as low as maybe 11 or 12. And if I were like the opinion police, I would say anything between 7 and 12. I'm not even going to argue with you. I might disagree, but it's just not even worth arguing. The disagreement is so small that I don't even care. Do you think that's fair? Or what would be your like acceptable window for ranking Trevor Lawrence?
I completely agree. Like my latest Dynasty rankings that I put out this earlier this week in Win Now rankings, which is really for the next 2 years, I have him 7th, and I have in the second tier of top starter, not elite. My elite quarterbacks are Mahomes, Allen, Jackson, and Hurts, and then after that I have Herbert, Tagovailoa, Burrow, and Lawrence. And I wish, and to be honest, if I saw, I've lowered Burrow only because I wondered how healthy he was, and then when I saw how healthy he was literally the afternoon after I posted these rankings, I probably would have Burrow above Herbert, and in the gold tier for that. I would keep him there. So I probably overreacted a little bit on that end of it. And then in terms of long build, where I'm looking at like 25 to 27 as my window of competition, he's 8th, and I have Mahomes, Allen, Jackson, Hurts, and Burrow all in that gold tier as my top 5 guys. And then beyond that, it's Tagovailoa and Lawrence, and then I have Herbert and Richardson just after them, with Fields and Goff rounding out that top starter tier. And they're all players that are in my top 50 picks, other than Goff. They're all guys that they're all players that I would say, if I'm building long and it's a 1 quarterback league, they're all guys that I would consider any of these players in my top 30 picks as someone that I feel like I could have as an anchor for my team. So yeah, I'm in total agreement with that idea of Lawrence in that way. And where it gets interesting is Tagovailoa and Herbert, because I have Lawrence 16th, Herbert 17th, and Richardson's 27th. And if Richardson didn't have an injury and have more injuries, he might have been higher up than those guys. But I want to see him, last more than a few games, I guess, before, and see what's going on and have a little bit of time there, and I can kind of afford to bake him in a little bit lower.
And I think too, the Herbert versus Lawrence comparison is interesting, because I mentioned, I looked at starts 18 through 42. Herbert had that amazing rookie season. Lawrence had that awful rookie season. Starts 18 to 42. Herbert is 17th and Lawrence is 19th in adjusted net yards per attempt. So, I mean, Herbert has a little bit better counting stats, but in terms of, because he has about 150 more pass attempts. But in terms of like, quote unquote, efficiency and level of play, like their stat that, the yards per completion, their completion percentage, their success rate, like they're all super, super, super close. And I feel like there's a little bit of discourse on Herbert, but I feel like people do a lot more hand wringing about Lawrence than they do about Herbert.
They do. And I think it's just that baked in narrative of like Herbert surprised everybody because he was, he looked like a great prospect and then dipped down in the eyes of people who were evaluating him. And then he performed better than expected early on. And then when you look at Lawrence, everyone had sky high, unrealistic expectations. Best prospect since Andrew Luck, and people, hand wrung about Luck too in that regard. So it's I don't know. I mean, it's easier to look at a player it's easier to come in on a player and say he's a way better prospect than people are saying, than to come in and say he's the best prospect that you've ever seen, and and then live up to it. So
yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think this show lives up to its hype, though. I don't know if we get a ton of hype. But, we'll hype it up because, you can find the great Adam Harstad at Footballguys and at Adam Harstad on Twitter. Does fantastic work, as you can see today. You're going to be a better player listening to what, Adam shares with us, on a weekly basis. I'm Matt Waldman. I'm along for the ride. You can find me at Matt Waldman on Twitter, and of course, at Footballguys. I've got a replacements article coming out. Hopefully we'll help you find someone if you're in desperate need to help you win a start this week. So thanks again, and you can tune into us on wherever you download podcasts at Matt Waldman's RSP Cast.